Alcatraz Mess Hall, 1934. 200 convicts eating lunch in silence. Al Capone sits alone at table 12, stirring his bowl of stew. Butcher Bill Miller walks past, stops, hacks up phlegm and spits directly into Capone's food. The hall goes dead quiet. Guards on the catwalks reach for their rifles. Every inmate waits for Capone to grab a shiv or flip the table. Instead, Capone looks up at Miller and smiles. A gentle, grandfatherly smile. "You look like you're starving, son. You need the protein more than I do." He slides the bowl across the table toward Miller, stands up slowly, pats Miller on the shoulder like he's a favorite nephew, then walks out without eating a bite. What Miller didn't know was that Capone had just signed his death warrant. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Alcatraz Island, August 11th, 1934, 3:17 p.m. 3 months earlier, the ferry had cut through San Francisco Bay carrying the most famous criminal in America. Al Capone sat in shackles, watching the rock grow larger through salt-stained windows. Behind him lay Chicago, his empire, his world. Ahead waited a concrete tomb designed to break men like him. The newspapers had called it the end of an era. Scarface Falls screamed the headlines. But the man in those shackles wasn't thinking about headlines. He was thinking about May, alone in their Miami mansion. About Sonny, his boy, learning to live with a father's shame. On the dock, Warden James Johnston waited with his clipboard and his rules. Johnston had built his reputation on one principle: no prisoner was special. Not bank robbers, not kidnappers, not Al Capone. "Welcome to Alcatraz, Convict 85, Johnston had said that first day. "Your Chicago days are over." Capone had nodded politely, like a dinner guest accepting hospitality. This small gesture, this refusal to rage or threaten, had puzzled the guards. They expected fury from a fallen king. Instead, they got mannered quiet. In those first weeks, Capone learned the rhythm of the rock. Wake at 6:30, count, breakfast in the mess hall, work detail in the laundry, count, lunch, back to the laundry, count, dinner, lock up by 5:30, lights out at 9. He kept a yellowed newspaper clipping folded inside his pillowcase. The Chicago Tribune headline read, "Capone convicted, 11 years." May had smuggled it to him in her first letter, not as a reminder of defeat, but as proof he had once mattered, that somewhere beyond these walls his name still carried weight. The other convicts watched him carefully those first months. Some expected him to claim territory, to build an organization inside the walls. Others waited for him to crack under the pressure of anonymity. Both groups were disappointed. Capone chose a different path. He read books in his cell. He wrote letters to May every Tuesday and Friday. He answered questions from younger inmates about life outside, but never about business. He attended Catholic Mass on Sundays, sitting in the back pew, head bowed in genuine prayer. The guards began to relax around him. Here was a middle-aged man serving his time quietly. No escape attempts, no violence, no schemes. Just an Italian grandfather counting days until he could hold his family again. But they underestimated what 45 years of survival had taught Al Capone. That patience was a weapon, that observation was intelligence, that in any closed system there were always predators and prey. William Butcher Bill Miller had arrived 6 months before Capone. Miller was everything Capone had never been: brutal without purpose, violent without calculation. He'd earned his nickname during a bank robbery in Kansas City, when he'd beaten a teller to death with a crowbar after the man had already opened the vault. In civilian life, men like Miller were useful muscle. In prison, they became kings. Miller had claimed the exercise yard through systematic brutality. He controlled the card games, the cigarette trades, the sexual hierarchies that determined who slept safely and who bled in dark corners. Miller had a crew of 5 men who followed him not from loyalty but from terror. Tommy Andretti, a fence from Pittsburgh who'd killed a cop. Frank Morrison, a kidnapper who'd cut off his victim's ear to prove he was serious. Mickey Torres, a numbers runner who'd survived 3 gang wars in Detroit. Eddie Kalinsky, a safe cracker who'd graduated to murder when a job went wrong. And Johnny Morelli, barely 23, doing life for armed robbery and rape. These men understood violence as currency. They paid Miller in fear and received protection in return. It was a simple economy that had served them well until August 11, 1934, the day Al Capone arrived. Miller had watched from the yard as the ferry docked. He knew that face from every newspaper in America. More importantly, he knew what that face represented, a threat to his carefully constructed kingdom. "That Chicago bastard thinks he can walk in here and take over," Miller had told his crew that first night. "He's got another thing coming." But Capone hadn't tried to take over anything. He'd simply existed quietly and politely, in a way that somehow made Miller's violence seem crude and desperate. The other inmates noticed. In the shower, in the yard, during work detail, they'd glance between Miller and Capone, measuring, comparing, the old king and the new, the calculator and the butcher. Miller felt this shift like a physical weight. His crew still followed orders, but their eyes lingered on Capone during meals. When Capone spoke, which was rarely, conversations stopped. Men listened to him discuss weather or baseball with the same attention they once paid to Miller's threats. This was the landscape that Tuesday in November when Miller decided to make his move. He'd planned it carefully. The mess hall, maximum audience. A humiliation so complete that every inmate would remember who ruled the Rock. What he hadn't planned for was Capone's reaction. Or rather, his non-reaction. As Miller stood over that table, watching Capone smile and slide the contaminated bowl away, something cold moved through his chest. This wasn't submission. This wasn't fear. This was something else entirely, something that felt like pity. The walk back to his cell that afternoon was the longest of Miller's life. Every inmate he passed looked at him differently. Not with fear anymore, with curiosity, with the expression men wear when watching a magic trick they don't understand. In his cell that night, Miller stared at the concrete ceiling and tried to understand what had happened. He'd humiliated Al Capone in front of 200 men. He'd marked his territory. He'd proven his dominance. So why did he feel like he'd just lost everything? Down the cell block, Capone sat at his small desk, writing his Tuesday letter to May. He told her about the weather, about the book he was reading, about how much he missed her Sunday gravy. He didn't mention Miller or the incident in the mess hall, but folded inside his pillowcase, next to that Tribune headline, was something new. A commissary receipt, an order for cigarettes, chocolate bars, and clean socks. Items that would be delivered to William Miller's cell the next morning. Alcatraz Island, November 16th, 1934 to 6:45 a.m. The commissary delivery came with breakfast, as always. But this morning, Guard Patterson stopped at cell 47 with an unusual package. William Miller sat on his bunk, watching through the bars as Patterson consulted his clipboard. "Miller, you got commissary. I didn't order nothing." Patterson shrugged. He'd been working the Rock for 3 years. Inmates lied about everything. "Says here you got cigarettes, candy bars, and socks. Someone's looking out for you." He passed the package through the slot. Miller stared at it like it might explode. Lucky Strike cigarettes, Hershey's chocolate bars, 3 pairs of clean white socks, items he couldn't afford, items he'd never ordered. Miller's hands shook as he read the delivery receipt. The signature at the bottom made his blood freeze. A. Capone, Convict 85. Down the cell block, other inmates were getting their morning deliveries. Miller could hear them talking, laughing, trading items. Normal prison commerce. But there was nothing normal about this package. He'd humiliated Al Capone yesterday, spat in his food in front of 200 men. And now Capone was sending him gifts. Miller's cellmate, Eddie Kalinsky, rolled over on his bunk. Eddie had been watching the package exchange with growing confusion. "Who sent you stuff?" Miller couldn't answer. His mouth had gone completely dry. "Miller, who sent it? Capone." Eddie sat up fast. "What?" "Al Capone sent me commissary." For 10 seconds, neither man spoke. Eddie stared at the package, then at Miller, then back at the package. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. Why would he do that? Miller had been asking himself the same question. There were only 2 possibilities, and both terrified him. Either Capone was setting him up for something, or Capone was making it look like Miller was working for him. Both options ended the same way, with Miller dead. By 8 o'clock, word had spread through the cell block. Miller tried to control the story, but prison gossip moved faster than wildfire. By the time they reached the mess hall for breakfast, every inmate knew that Butcher Bill had received gifts from the Chicago King. Miller sat at his usual table with his crew. Tommy Andretti kept glancing at other tables, watching inmates whisper and point. Frank Morrison picked at his eggs without speaking. Mickey Torres stared at Miller with the expression of a man reassessing old assumptions. The silence stretched until Johnny Morelli, the youngest of the group, finally asked what everyone was thinking. "Bill, what's going on with you and Capone?" "Nothing's going on." "Then why'd he send you stuff?" Miller slammed his fork down harder than he'd intended. "I don't know why he sent it." But Tommy Andretti was studying his face with the careful attention of a man who'd survived 3 decades of criminal partnerships. Tommy knew the signs of a secret deal. The defensive posture, the quick anger, the refusal to make eye contact. "You making arrangements with that Chicago bastard?" "I told you there's no arrangement." "Then why don't you send the stuff back?" Miller hadn't thought of that. It was such an obvious solution that his failure to consider it immediately made him look guilty. He could see the realization spreading across his crew's faces. "Maybe I will send it back. Maybe." Frank Morrison spoke for the first time that morning. "What do you mean, maybe?" Miller looked around the table at 4 men who'd followed him for 18 months. Men who'd killed for him, bled for him, trusted their lives to his judgment. Now they were looking at him like he was a stranger, like he was a traitor. Across the mess hall, Al Capone sat at his usual table, eating breakfast with the same calm attention he'd shown every morning for 3 months. He didn't look toward Miller's table, didn't acknowledge the commotion he'd caused, just ate his eggs and read a 3-day-old newspaper like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. During work detail that morning, Miller tried to approach Capone in the laundry room. He wanted to understand the game, to figure out the rules before he lost everything. But when he got within 10 feet, Capone looked up from his pressing machine with such genuine confusion that Miller stopped walking. "Something I can help you with, son?" "Son," the same word he'd used yesterday in the mess hall, spoken with the tone of a concerned father addressing a troubled child. "The commissary stuff." "Oh, that." Capone smiled warmly. "You looked hungry yesterday. Figured you could use some extra nutrition." Miller stared at him. Capone's face showed nothing but grandfatherly concern. No calculation, no hidden agenda, just a wealthy man helping out a less fortunate neighbor, which was somehow more terrifying than any threat. "I don't need your charity. No charity. Just one convict looking out for another." Capone returned to his pressing. "We're all in the same boat here." Miller wanted to argue, to threaten, to establish some kind of understanding. But Capone had already dismissed him with the polite finality of a man ending a pleasant but insignificant conversation. Walking back to his cell that afternoon, Miller felt the weight of every stare, every whispered conversation, every speculative glance. The gifts hadn't just made him look weak, they'd made him look bought. In the exercise yard, his crew gathered around him with questions he couldn't answer. Why had Capone chosen him? What did the Chicago outfit want from them? How long had Miller been planning this? "There's no plan," Miller insisted. "I hate that bastard as much as you do." But Tommy Andretti had been thinking about it all day. "Maybe that's the point. Maybe you're supposed to hate him. Makes it look real when you work together." "I'm not working with him." "Then prove it." Miller looked around the yard. 200 inmates were watching their conversation with the focused attention of men betting on a cockfight. Word of this confrontation would spread within hours. By dinner, every convict on the Rock would know that Butcher Bill's own crew was questioning his loyalty. "How do I prove it?" Tommy leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Kill him. Tonight. In the showers. Make it quick and clean." For a moment, Miller considered it. It would solve everything, restore his reputation, silence the rumors, prove his independence. But something in Capone's smile yesterday had felt like a trap, like the old man was hoping for exactly this reaction. "We wait," Miller said finally. "See what he does next." Tommy's eyes narrowed. What if there is no next? What if he's already gotten what he wanted? Miller didn't have an answer for that, because he was starting to realize that he didn't understand what Capone wanted at all. Alcatraz Island, November 17th, 1934 to 2:30 p.m. Miller decided to force Capone's hand. If the old man wanted to play games, Miller would give him a game worth playing. During afternoon recreation, Miller walked directly to Capone's usual spot near the library. Capone sat reading a biography of Napoleon, his back against the concrete wall, afternoon sun warming his face. He looked up as Miller approached, his expression brightening with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. "Bill, isn't it? How are you settling in?" The casual familiarity hit Miller like a slap. Capone spoke as if they were old friends, as if the spitting incident had never happened, as if Miller's reputation meant nothing. "We need to talk, of course." Capone closed his book, marking his place carefully. "What's on your mind?" Miller had rehearsed this conversation in his cell, planning each word for maximum impact. But standing here, facing Capone's grandfatherly calm, his prepared speech crumbled. "Stop sending me things." "Things?" "The commissary. The gifts." "Stop it." Capone's brow furrowed with apparent confusion. "I'm sorry, son. I thought you might appreciate a little kindness. Prison's hard enough without going hungry." Son. There was that word again, spoken with such paternal concern that Miller almost believed it was genuine. Almost. "I don't want your kindness." "Well," Capone's voice carried a note of hurt disappointment. "If that's how you feel, that's how I feel. I understand. Some men prefer to handle things alone." Capone reopened his book, no shame in that. Miller stood there for another moment, waiting for something more. A threat, a negotiation, some acknowledgement of the game being played. But Capone had already returned to reading about Napoleon's retreat from Moscow, apparently fascinated by the tactical decisions of a man who died a century before either of them was born. Walking away, Miller felt more confused than when he'd arrived. He'd confronted Capone directly, made his position clear, forced the issue into the open. So why did he feel like he'd just lost another round? The answer came 3 hours later during dinner. Miller sat with his crew at their usual table, picking at a plate of beans and cornbread. The mess hall buzzed with the normal sounds of 200 men eating institutional food. Conversations about guard schedules, commissary prices, letters from home. Then Guard Patterson appeared at Miller's shoulder. "Miller, you got a visitor at the commissary window." Miller hadn't ordered anything, hadn't requested anything, but he followed Patterson across the hall, aware that every conversation had stopped, every eye was watching. At the commissary window, Clerk Morrison handed Miller a small package wrapped in brown paper. The delivery slip showed the same familiar signature, A. Capone, Convict 85. "I told him to stop," Miller said. Morrison shrugged. "Tell him louder, I guess." Miller unwrapped the package in front of 200 witnesses. Inside were 3 items, a bar of quality soap, a pack of playing cards, and a small mirror. Luxury items in a place where luxury meant survival. But it was the note tucked between the cards that made Miller's hands shake. "For my young friend Billy. Sometimes a man needs to see himself clearly. Best wishes." Al. The handwriting was careful, elegant. The tone was affectionate, and every inmate in the hall could see Miller reading it. Miller looked across the mess hall toward Capone's table. The old man was finishing his dinner, dabbing at his mouth with a napkin with the same precise care he'd shown folding the note. When their eyes met, Capone raised his coffee cup in a small salute, his face radiating proud satisfaction, like a father watching his son open a birthday present. The walk back to his table felt like a death march. Miller's crew watched his approach with expressions ranging from suspicion to open hostility. Other tables had gone quiet, inmates leaning forward to catch every word of the conversation they knew was coming. Miller sat down heavily, placing the package in the center of the table. "Well?" Tommy Andretti's voice was flat, dangerous. "He sent more stuff. We can see that." Frank Morrison picked up the note, reading it slowly. "Billy? He calls you Billy?" Miller had no answer for that. The diminutive was somehow worse than the gifts themselves. It suggested intimacy, familiarity, a relationship that went beyond simple business. "How long?" Mickey Torres spoke quietly, but his words carried across the silent mess hall. "How long what? How long have you been working with him?" "I'm not working with him." But the denial sounded weak even to Miller's ears. The evidence was piling up. Repeated gifts, friendly notes, pet names. From the outside, it looked exactly like a developing partnership. Johnny Morelli, the youngest member of the crew, pushed his plate away untouched. "This is bad, Bill. People are talking." Miller looked around the mess hall. Morelli was right. At every table, inmates were watching their conversation with the focused attention of spectators at an execution. Some looked curious. Others looked hungry, like sharks sensing blood in the water. What kind of talking? The kind that gets people killed, Tommy said. The kind where they wonder if you're feeding information to Chicago connections. The kind where they start thinking maybe Butcher Bill isn't so independent after all. Miller felt the walls closing in. He'd built his reputation on brutal independence, on being the man who answered to nobody. Now that reputation was cracking under the weight of Capone's inexplicable generosity. "So what do you want me to do?" "End it." Frank Morrison's voice was cold. "Tonight, in the showers. Make it look like an accident." Miller had considered this option before, but something held him back. Maybe it was the memory of Capone's smile in the mess hall the day before. Maybe it was the careful way the old man had folded that note. Or maybe it was the growing suspicion that killing Capone would somehow make things worse, not better. "We wait." "Wait for what?" Tommy demanded. "Wait to see what he's really after." But even as he said it, Miller wondered if he was making the biggest mistake of his life. Around them, the mess hall was returning to normal conversation, but he could feel the undercurrent of speculation, the whispered theories about secret alliances and hidden agendas. That night, lying in his bunk, Miller stared at the small mirror Capone had sent him. In its reflection, he saw a man who looked tired, confused, older than his 34 years, a man who'd controlled every situation he'd ever faced until now, a man who was losing a game he didn't understand to an opponent who seemed to be playing by different rules entirely. 3 cells down, Al Capone sat at his small desk, writing another letter to May. He told her about the book he was reading, about the beautiful sunset he'd watched from the yard, about how much he missed her cooking. He didn't mention Miller or the gifts or the careful way he was dismantling a man's reputation one act of kindness at a time. But folded inside his pillowcase, next to the Tribune headline and the commissary receipts, was something new, a hand-drawn map of the prison showing guard rotations, inmate territories, and the growing network of relationships that connected every convict on the Rock. A map that showed Miller's shrinking influence and Capone's expanding web of subtle alliances. A map that proved Al Capone had never stopped being the most dangerous man in any room he entered. Alcatraz Island, November 20th, 1934, had become a living thing, feeding on every glance, every whispered conversation, every moment of silence that stretched too long. For 3 days he'd watched his world crumble one suspicion at a time. It started with small things. Eddie Kalinsky, his cellmate, had stopped talking about their escape plans. During work detail, Frank Morrison chose a pressing station on the opposite side of the laundry room. Mickey Torres no longer saved him a seat during meals, but it was the way other inmates looked at him that cut deepest. Where once he'd seen fear and respect, now he found curiosity and calculation. Men were studying him the way they studied potential victims, measuring his weaknesses, testing his responses. The letters had started arriving on Tuesday. Not letters to Miller, letters to other inmates, delivered through the normal mail system. But somehow, word of their contents spread through the cell blocks like wildfire. Letters from Chicago. Letters mentioning favors owed, old debts remembered, connections maintained. Letters that suggested Al Capone still had friends on the outside. Miller couldn't prove the letters were real, couldn't even prove they existed. But the rumors were enough. In a place where information was currency and paranoia was survival, the suggestion of outside influence carried more weight than facts. During his Tuesday library visit, Miller found Capone in his usual spot, reading a biography of Julius Caesar. The old man looked up as Miller approached, his face brightening with the same grandfatherly warmth that had become Miller's nightmare. "Billy, good to see you, son. How are you holding up?" The casual use of the nickname in public made Miller's skin crawl. Every inmate within 20 feet could hear the familiarity, the implied intimacy. "People are talking, are they?" Capone marked his place in the book with careful attention. "What are they saying?" "You know what they're saying." Capone's expression shifted to one of concerned confusion. "I'm afraid I don't. Has someone been bothering you?" The innocent act was flawless. Standing there, watching Capone's face, Miller almost believed the old man genuinely didn't understand the chaos he was creating. The gifts, the notes. "People think we're working together." "Oh." Capone's face fell, showing what appeared to be genuine distress. "Oh, Billy, I'm so sorry. I never meant to cause you trouble." "Then stop." "Of course. Absolutely." Capone nodded emphatically. "I'll make sure everyone knows there's no arrangement between us." Miller felt a moment of relief. Finally, Capone was going to end this madness. "Thank you. Don't mention it. A man's reputation is all he has in a place like this." Miller walked away feeling lighter than he had in days. The nightmare was ending. Capone would clarify things publicly, the rumors would die, and Miller could begin rebuilding his credibility with his crew. The relief lasted exactly 4 hours. During dinner, Guard Patterson appeared at Miller's table with another commissary delivery. This time, the package was larger, wrapped in pristine brown paper, tied with string that looked expensive. Miller's hands shook as he unwrapped it in front of the entire mess hall. Inside was a collection of items that must have cost a month's worth of commissary credits: premium tobacco, imported soap, leather shoe polish, writing paper, and 3 chocolate bars wrapped in gold foil. The note tucked inside was longer this time, written in the same elegant handwriting. "Dear Billy, I heard through the grapevine that some people were giving you trouble about our friendship. I wanted to make sure everyone knows how much I value your loyalty and discretion. These small tokens are just my way of saying thank you for everything you've done. Your devoted friend," Al Miller read the note 3 times, each word hitting him like a physical blow. Capone hadn't ended the rumors, he'd made them worse, much worse. The phrase loyalty and discretion suggested services rendered. The mention of everything you've done implied a history of cooperation. And the expensive gifts announced to every inmate in the hall that Miller was under Al Capone's protection and patronage. Miller looked across the mess hall toward Capone's table. The old man was eating his dinner with calm satisfaction, occasionally glancing toward Miller's table with the proud expression of a benefactor watching his protege enjoy a well-deserved reward. When their eyes met, Capone raised his coffee cup in another small salute, his smile radiating warmth and approval. Miller wanted to scream, wanted to tear up the note, throw the gifts in Capone's face, declare war in front of 200 witnesses. But he could feel the weight of all those eyes watching him, measuring his reaction, drawing their own conclusions about what they were seeing. Any response would confirm the rumors. Anger would suggest a partnership gone bad. Gratitude would confirm the alliance. Even indifference would be interpreted as professional discretion. Capone had trapped him in a web of perception where every move made things worse. Tommy Andretti leaned across the table, his voice barely audible. "We need to talk, tonight." Miller nodded, still staring at the note in his hands. Around them, conversations had resumed, but he could feel the undercurrent of speculation, the whispered theories spreading from table to table like infection. That evening, Miller's crew gathered in the shower room during the hour before lockdown. The space was empty except for the 5 men who'd followed Miller for 18 months and now looked at him like he was a stranger. Tommy did most of the talking, his voice echoing off the tiled walls. "It's over, Bill. Whatever deal you made with Chicago, it's burning us all. There's no deal. Then explain the gifts, explain the notes, explain why Al Capone is treating you like his favorite nephew." Miller had no explanation that made sense. The truth that he was being systematically destroyed by a man he'd tried to humiliate sounded like the desperate lie of a caught traitor. "Maybe he's trying to recruit me. Maybe I'm playing along to see what he wants." Frank Morrison shook his head. "Nobody plays Al Capone, Bill. You either work for him or you don't. And if you work for him," Mickey Torres added quietly, "you don't work for us." The ultimatum hung in the humid air between them. Miller could see the decision crystallizing in their faces. Loyalty was binary, and he'd chosen the wrong side. "You got 24 hours, Tommy said finally. "Either you end this thing with Capone, or we end it for you." Miller spent that night lying awake, staring at the concrete ceiling of his cell. Through the bars, he could see other inmates in their bunks, most sleeping peacefully. Men who knew their place in the prison hierarchy, who understood the rules, who could navigate the simple mathematics of survival. Men who weren't being destroyed by kindness. Eddie Kalinsky rolled over on his bunk, speaking into the darkness. "Bill? Yeah, you really working with the Chicago outfit?" Miller considered lying, but what was the point? "No. Then why's he doing this to you?" It was the question Miller had been asking himself for a week. Why would Al Capone waste time and money destroying a small-time prison gang? What did he gain from Miller's downfall? I don't know. Eddie was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful, almost philosophical. My grandmother used to tell stories about old country vendettas. Said the worst thing you could do to a man wasn't kill him, it was make him kill himself. Miller turned toward his cellmate's bunk. What's that supposed to mean? Maybe it means Al Capone's been playing a longer game than any of us figured. Down the cell block, in cell 85, Al Capone sat reading by the light of a single bulb. Not Caesar this time, but Sun Tzu's Art of War, a book he'd studied many times before. The ancient Chinese general had understood something that most men missed. The supreme excellence of warfare was to subdue the enemy without fighting. Folded inside the book's pages was a torn fragment of a letter from Chicago. Not the whole letter, just enough to show a letterhead, a familiar signature, a reference to the favor you asked for regarding our mutual friend. The fragment would find its way into the prison mail system tomorrow, carried by a guard who owed Capone a small debt. It would be discovered during a routine inspection, investigated briefly, and filed away as evidence of ongoing criminal connections. By evening, every inmate on Alcatraz would know that Al Capone still had friends in Chicago. Friends who were willing to do favors. Friends who were keeping track of his mutual friends in prison. Friends who might be very interested in anyone who threatened their old associate's comfort and safety. Capone closed the book and prepared for bed, moving with the careful routine of a man who understood that patience was the deadliest weapon of all. Alcatraz Island, November 21st, 1934 to 5:45 a.m. Miller woke to the sound of his cell door opening. Guard Patterson stood in the doorway with two other guards, their faces grim with the expression of men conducting unpleasant business. "Step out, Miller. Cell inspection." Miller's blood went cold. Random cell inspections were rare on Alcatraz, and when they happened, they usually meant someone was about to lose privileges, spend time in solitary or worse. He stood in the corridor in his underwear and prison-issued slippers, watching through the bars as the guards systematically tore apart everything he owned. They pulled apart his mattress, examined every book page by page, checked the seams of his clothes for contraband. Eddie Kolinsky stood beside him, equally confused. Cell inspections typically happened when guards received tips about weapons, escape plans, or forbidden communications, but Miller had been careful about all of those things. Guard Patterson emerged from the cell holding something in his hand. A piece of metal, roughly 6 inches long, sharpened to a vicious point. A shiv, professionally made and deadly sharp. Well, what do we have here? Miller stared at the weapon in complete shock. "That's not mine. Found it sewn into your mattress. Pretty professional work. I've never seen that before in my life." Patterson's expression was skeptical. He'd been working prisons for 15 years and had heard every denial imaginable. "Sure you haven't. Search his stuff." Miller pointed desperately toward Eddie's bunk. "Search everything. I don't have weapons. I don't need weapons." But the guards had found what they were looking for. Standard procedure called for Miller to be written up, lose privileges, and spend 30 days in solitary confinement. Instead, Patterson made a notation on his clipboard and ordered Miller back into his cell. "This goes in your file. Next infraction, you're looking at serious time in the hole." The guards left, but their discovery spread through the cell block within minutes. By breakfast, every inmate knew that Butcher Bill Miller had been caught with a professionally made shiv hidden in his mattress. The timing was perfect. Miller's crew was already questioning his loyalty. Other inmates were already suspicious about his relationship with Capone, and now he'd been caught with a weapon that suggested he was planning violence. But against whom? Miller sat in the mess hall, staring at a plate of eggs he couldn't eat. His crew occupied their usual table, but they weren't talking to him. Other inmates shot him curious glances, the kind reserved for men whose situations had become interesting. Across the hall, Al Capone ate his breakfast with the same methodical calm he'd shown every morning for 3 months. He didn't look toward Miller's table, didn't acknowledge the tension that filled the room like smoke. But when Miller caught his eye for just a moment, Capone's expression showed something new. Not grandfatherly concern or innocent confusion. Satisfaction. Pure, cold satisfaction. Miller finally understood the game. The gifts hadn't been attempts at recruitment or friendship. They'd been bait, designed to make him look corrupt while isolating him from his allies. The notes weren't expressions of affection. They were evidence of a relationship that existed only in other people's minds. And the shiv wasn't random bad luck. It was the final piece of a puzzle that painted Miller as a dangerous man with divided loyalties and violent intentions. But understanding the trap didn't help him escape it. During work detail, Miller tried to approach his crew in the laundry room. They saw him coming and moved away, forming a tight circle near the folding tables. When he got close enough to speak, Tommy Andretti turned to face him with cold finality. "We talked it over. Tommy, listen to me. Capone planted that shiv. He's setting me up. Maybe he is." Tommy's voice was flat. "Maybe he isn't. Doesn't matter anymore." "What do you mean it doesn't matter?" Frank Morrison stepped forward, his face hard with decision. "Means you're radioactive now, Bill. Whether you're working with Chicago or not, being around you is dangerous." Miller felt his world collapsing. These men had followed him through 18 months of prison politics, had trusted their lives to his judgment, had helped him build a reputation that commanded respect throughout Alcatraz. Now they were cutting him loose like infected tissue. "You're making a mistake." "Maybe. But it's our mistake to make." Mickey Torres, who'd been silent until now, finally spoke. "You got until tomorrow night, Bill. After that, you're on your own." Miller stood in the laundry room, surrounded by the noise of pressing machines and folding stations, watching his crew walk away. Other inmates had noticed the confrontation, and he could see them processing the implications. If Butcher Bill's own men were abandoning him, his protection was gone. In prison mathematics, a man without allies was a man without a future. That afternoon, Miller lay on his bunk, staring at the mattress where the guards had found the planted weapon. Eddie Kolinsky sat at the small desk, writing a letter to his sister in Pittsburgh. The normalcy of the scene, two men sharing a cell, one writing home, felt surreal given the magnitude of Miller's situation. "Eddie, yeah? When they move me, don't room with anyone connected to my crew." Eddie stopped writing. "They moving you? After what happened this morning? They'll have to. For my own protection." Eddie turned to face him, his expression thoughtful. "Bill, can I ask you something?" "Go ahead. That first day when you spit in Capone's food, what were you trying to prove?" Miller had asked himself the same question 100 times over the past week. What had driven him to humiliate the most famous criminal in America? Pride, stupidity, a need to establish dominance? "I wanted everyone to know I wasn't afraid of him." Eddie nodded slowly. "You think he was afraid of you? What?" "I've been thinking about this. Al Capone built an empire in Chicago, survived gang wars, federal investigations, attempts on his life. You really think he was worried about some bank robber from Kansas City?" Miller had never considered that perspective. He'd seen his confrontation with Capone as a challenge between equals, a test of wills between two alpha predators. But maybe Eddie was right. Maybe from Capone's perspective, Miller had been nothing more than an annoying insect requiring elimination. So what was the spitting about then? Eddie returned to his letter, speaking without looking up. "Maybe it wasn't about fear. Maybe it was about respect. Maybe you disrespected a man who's used to respect, and now he's teaching you why." That evening, Miller received his final gift from Al Capone. Guard Patterson delivered it personally, his expression unreadable as he handed over a small package wrapped in the same brown paper as all the others. Inside was a single item, a bar of prison soap, carved into the rough shape of a rose. The craftsmanship was crude but recognizable, the kind of artwork inmates made in their cells during long, empty hours. The note was shorter than the others, written in the same elegant handwriting. "Dear Billy, heard you were having some trouble with friends. Sometimes a peace offering helps smooth things over. Hope this gesture shows there are no hard feelings on my end. Wishing you well." Al. Miller stared at the carved soap rose, understanding its meaning completely. It wasn't a peace offering, it was a funeral flower, a final gesture of mock sympathy before the inevitable end. Capone was telling him that the game was over, and Miller had lost. Alcatraz Island, November 22, 1934 to 8:30 a.m. Miller knew he was living on borrowed time. The carved soap rose sat on his cell desk like a ticking clock, marking the hours until his former crew decided his continued existence was too dangerous to tolerate. He'd spent the night trying to formulate a plan, seek protective custody, request a transfer, find new allies. But every option led to the same conclusion. In a closed system like Alcatraz, There was nowhere to run from a reputation, and his reputation was now toxic. During breakfast, he made one last attempt to reason with his crew. Tommy Andretti saw him approaching and shook his head slightly, a warning that carried the weight of 18 months of shared violence and mutual trust. Miller sat down anyway. Tommy, listen to me. 5 minutes. Bill, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Capone played us all. The gifts, the notes, the planted weapon. He's been running a game since day one. Tommy's expression didn't change. Doesn't matter anymore. How can you say that? We built something together. We controlled this place. We controlled this place when you were clean. Frank Morrison leaned across the table, his voice barely audible. Now you're compromised. Whether it's real or not, whether it's fair or not, you're compromised. Miller looked around the table at 4 men who'd once trusted him with their lives. Mickey Torres wouldn't meet his eyes. Johnny Morelli picked at his eggs with nervous intensity. Eddie Kolinsky, his own cellmate, stared at his coffee like it contained answers to questions he was afraid to ask. So that's it? 5 years of partnership, and you're just going to cut me loose? Tommy finally looked at him directly. Bill, you spit in that man's food thinking you were showing strength. Instead, you showed him exactly who you were. A small-time tough guy who didn't understand the game he was playing. I understand it now. Too late. Understanding comes after consequences in this business. Miller felt the conversation slipping away from him. These weren't his enemies talking, they were his friends, trying to survive in a situation his actions had created. What if I could fix it? What if I could prove there's no deal with Capone? How you gonna prove that? I'll kill him myself. Tonight. In the showers. Make it public. The suggestion hung in the air between them like smoke. Tommy studied Miller's face, looking for signs of desperation, of a man making promises he couldn't keep. You think you can take Al Capone? He's an old man. Soft from years of easy living. He's Al Capone. The man who survived Chicago gang wars when tougher guys than you ended up in the Chicago River. Miller knew Tommy was right, but desperation was making him reckless. Then help me, like old times. For a moment, Miller thought he saw hesitation in Tommy's eyes, the memory of shared battles, mutual loyalty, the bonds that had held their crew together through 18 months of prison politics. Then Tommy shook his head. Can't do it, Bill. Win or lose, we can't be connected to whatever happens next. Miller stood up slowly, understanding that the conversation was over. His crew, his brothers, had made their choice. They were cutting him loose to save themselves, and he couldn't even blame them for it. Walking away from the table felt like walking away from his own identity. During work detail, Miller found himself isolated in the laundry room. Other inmates gave him space, the kind of space reserved for men marked for death. He pressed clothes in mechanical silence, watching steam rise from the industrial machines, trying to process the magnitude of his situation. Al Capone worked at a station 20 feet away, handling each garment with the same careful attention he'd shown everything else since arriving at Alcatraz. He didn't acknowledge Miller's presence, didn't gloat or threaten, just pressed clothes with the quiet efficiency of a man completing routine tasks. But Miller could feel the weight of those eyes, occasionally tracking his movements, measuring his desperation, calculating the exact moment when a cornered animal became most dangerous. That afternoon, Miller made his final play. He approached Warden Johnston's office during the hour when inmates could request meetings about legitimate grievances. The secretary, a thin woman with steel-rimmed glasses, looked up from her typewriter with professional disinterest. I need to see the warden. What's this regarding? Threats against my safety. I need protective custody. She made a note on her calendar. He can see you at 4 o'clock. 5 minutes. Miller spent the intervening hours rehearsing his story. He would tell Johnston about the planted weapon, the suspicious gifts, the growing isolation from his own crew. He would request immediate transfer to a different cell block, different work detail, different everything. But when 4 o'clock arrived, Miller found himself sitting across from a man who'd heard every con imaginable from every inmate who'd ever passed through his office. What's the problem, Miller? Someone's trying to set me up. Make it look like I'm working with outside connections. Johnston consulted Miller's file. You mean the commissary gifts from Capone? Miller's heart sank. Of course Johnston knew about the gifts. In a place like Alcatraz, the warden knew about everything that mattered. Those gifts are part of a setup. Capone's trying to make my crew think I'm compromised. "Are you?" "No, sir." Johnston studied Miller's face with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent decades evaluating criminal credibility. "Miller, you've been a model prisoner since arrival. No infractions, no violence, good work reports. But yesterday we found a weapon in your cell. That was planted. By whom?" Miller hesitated. Accusing Al Capone of orchestrating an elaborate psychological campaign sounded insane when spoken aloud. "I can't prove it yet. Then I can't help you yet." Johnston closed the file. "Prison politics aren't my concern unless they threaten institutional security. Handle your personal issues personally." Miller left the office understanding that he was completely alone. The administration wouldn't help him. His crew had abandoned him. And somewhere in the complex hierarchy of prison alliances and betrayals, his former allies were finalizing plans for his elimination. That evening, Miller sat in his cell staring at the carved soap rose. Eddie Kalinsky had requested an emergency cellmate transfer, leaving Miller alone with his thoughts and his rapidly dwindling options. Through the bars he could hear normal prison sounds, men talking, playing cards, reading letters from home. The routine noises of incarceration that had become background music over 18 months of careful reputation building. Music that now sounded like a funeral dirge. Down the cell block, Al Capone prepared for bed with the same methodical routine he'd followed every night since arriving at Alcatraz. But tonight, he moved with the satisfaction of a chess player who could see checkmate approaching in the movements of pieces his opponent didn't yet realize were doomed. Tomorrow would bring the final move in a game that had begun with a glob of spit in a bowl of prison stew. A game that had never really been about respect or dominance or prison politics. A game that had always been about teaching one simple lesson: there were consequences for disrespecting Al Capone, even in a place designed to strip away every advantage he'd ever possessed. Alcatraz Island, November 23, 1934 to 2:15 p.m. The showers were always dangerous during the hour before dinner. Guards minimized their presence. Inmates moved in small groups, and the sound of running water masked conversations that couldn't happen anywhere else. Miller knew this. His crew knew this. And somewhere in the careful choreography of prison routine, everyone understood that today would be different. Miller had spent the morning in the exercise yard, sitting alone on a concrete bench, watching other inmates form their natural clusters. His former crew occupied their usual corner near the weight pile, talking in low voices while maintaining visual contact with his position. They weren't hiding their intentions anymore. The decision had been made, the logistics worked out, the timing agreed upon. Miller could read it in their body language, the careful way they avoided eye contact, the subtle positioning that kept him isolated from potential allies. At lunch, he'd sat alone for the first time since arriving at Alcatraz. The social mathematics of prison hierarchy had shifted, and his table had become a place other inmates avoided. Not from fear of him, but from fear of association with a marked man. Al Capone had eaten his meal 3 tables away, reading a letter from home with the focused attention of a grandfather catching up on family news. When he'd finished reading, he'd folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket, glancing toward Miller's table with an expression of mild curiosity. The look lasted exactly 2 seconds, long enough for every inmate in the mess hall to notice, short enough to maintain plausible innocence. But in those 2 seconds, Miller saw something that chilled him more than any direct threat: pity. Al Capone was looking at him the way a man looks at roadkill, with detached regret for something that had served its purpose and was now simply debris to be cleared away. During afternoon work detail, Miller had tried to position himself near guards, staying visible, maintaining witnesses. But the laundry room was large, and industrial noise provided perfect cover for quick violence. Tommy Andretti and Frank Morrison worked stations near the door. Mickey Torres operated a pressing machine that blocked the supervisor's view. Johnny Morelli handled the sorting table between Miller and the emergency alarm. The positioning was subtle but unmistakable. His former crew had turned the laundry room into a kill box. At 2:10, the work whistle blew. Inmates began moving toward their cells through corridors connecting the industrial areas to the living quarters. Miller walked toward the showers, knowing he was walking toward his death. The shower room was a long, tiled space with 12 shower heads arranged along 2 walls. Steam rose from the hot water, creating a humid fog that reduced visibility and muffled sound. Perfect conditions for murder. Miller chose a center showerhead, reasoning it would be harder for his crew to approach unseen. He undressed slowly, hanging his clothes on wall hooks, trying to project calm while his heart hammered. For 5 minutes, nothing happened. Water cascaded from multiple showerheads, inmates washed and talked, normal institutional hygiene continued. Miller began wondering if he'd misread the situation. Maybe his paranoia had overcome his judgment. Then Tommy Andretti entered the shower room. He moved casually, carrying towel and soap, nodding to other inmates. But Miller noticed how he scanned the room, counting positions, measuring distances. Frank Morrison appeared 30 seconds later, followed by Mickey Torres. They spread out naturally, claiming showerheads forming a loose triangle around Miller's position. Johnny Morelli entered last, carrying something wrapped in his towel, something small and sharp. Miller understood that his 18 months of reputation building, systematic intimidation, cultivation of fear and respect had led to this moment. He'd taught these men to kill without hesitation, and now they were applying those lessons to him. Tommy caught Miller's eye and nodded slightly, not greeting but acknowledgement. Respect between professionals who understood the necessity of what was about to happen. Miller nodded back. After everything they'd shared, he owed them that dignity. Johnny moved first, sliding close with casual motion. The shiv emerged from the towel, smoothly sharpened metal that would puncture organs and sever arteries with surgical precision. Miller didn't fight, didn't scream, didn't beg for mercy or curse his betrayers. He accepted the blade with stoic resignation of a man who understood how stories like his always ended. The first wound was to his kidney, delivered with expertise of men who'd killed before. The second opened his throat, ensuring silence. The third and fourth were insurance, making certain William "Butcher Bill" Miller would never threaten anyone again. He was dead before his body hit the shower floor. Tommy, Frank, Mickey, and Johnny worked with professional efficiency, washing blood from hands, cleaning the weapon, arranging the scene to suggest accident rather than murder. By the time they left, Miller's blood was swirling down the drain with soap suds and steam, disappearing into the prison's plumbing like it had never existed. At 2:45, Guard Patterson discovered the body during routine patrol. Miller lay on wet tile, skull cracked from what appeared to be a fatal fall, water washing evidence toward floor drains. The official report would list the death as accidental. Prison showers were notoriously dangerous, slippery surfaces, hard surfaces, minimal supervision. Inmates died in shower falls every year. Just another statistic. At the moment of Miller's death, Al Capone sat in the yard playing cards with 3 inmates under guard supervision. The game was pinochle, and Capone was losing gracefully, making jokes about his poor luck while maintaining perfect alibis through continuous conversation. When news of Miller's accident reached the yard 20 minutes later, Capone received it with mild concern he showed for any institutional tragedy. He shook his head sadly, muttered about prison dangers, and suggested a moment of silence. Then he returned to his cards, drawing a fresh hand with hands that had never touched a weapon, never issued a threat, never done anything more violent than slide a contaminated bowl across a table. Hands that were completely, demonstrably clean. Alcatraz Island, November 23, 1934, 6:30 p.m. The body bag emerged from the shower block on a wheeled gurney, pushed by orderlies who'd seen this routine too many times. Prison deaths were paperwork, nothing more. A brief investigation, a medical report, a notation in institutional records. William "Butcher Bill" Miller would be buried in a pauper's grave in San Francisco, his Kansas City bank robberies forgotten, his Alcatraz reign reduced to a single line in the warden's monthly mortality report. Al Capone watched the procession from his cell window, hands clasped behind his back like a mourner at a funeral. Other inmates gathered at their windows, but their expressions showed curiosity rather than grief. Miller had been feared, not loved. His death created opportunities rather than sorrow. The aftermath was surgical in its efficiency. Tommy Andretti assumed control of Miller's territories, the card games, commissary trades, protection rackets that made prison life bearable for those who could afford it. Frank Morrison and Mickey Torres fell into lieutenant roles. Johnny Morelli, the youngest, received promotion to enforcer. None spoke about what happened in the shower. None needed to. The power transition was seamless, professional, inevitable. By evening, Alcatraz had settled into its new normal. The exercise yard buzzed with conversations about territorial boundaries and shifting alliances, but the violence was over. Miller's death had resolved the tension building since November 15th, when Spit landed in a bowl of prison stew. Capone returned to his routine as if nothing had changed. He read books, wrote letters to May, attended Catholic Mass on Sundays. Guards who'd watched him carefully during the Miller situation relaxed their vigilance, convinced that the old gangster was exactly what he appeared, a middle-aged man serving his time quietly. The commissary orders stopped. No more gifts, no more notes, no more mysterious gestures toward dangerous inmates. Capone had achieved his objective, and there was no need to continue the performance. But in his cell that evening, preparing for bed, Capone allowed himself quiet satisfaction. He'd been stripped of his empire, wealth, freedom, reputation. But he'd proven something that mattered more. He'd proven that Al Capone was still Al Capone. The new commissary order form sat on his desk, filled out in careful handwriting. Standard items: soap, tobacco, writing paper. The mundane supplies of a man living within the system's rules. The king was dead. Long live the king. Alcatraz Island, November 17, 1934 to 2:30 p.m. The next afternoon brought another commissary delivery to cell 47. This time it was soap, writing paper, and a pack of playing cards. Again, signed by a Capone, convict, 85. Miller stared at the package through his cell bars, refusing to touch it. But refusing didn't matter. Every inmate in the cell block had seen Guard Patterson make the delivery. The damage was already done. By evening, Tommy Andretti had drawn a rough map of the prison on the back of an envelope. He'd marked Miller's territory in the exercise yard, the shower schedules he controlled, the card games that paid him tribute. 18 months of careful empire building, reduced to pencil marks on stolen paper. "Look at this," Tommy said, spreading the map across Miller's bunk. "Every area you control, every guy who pays you respect. Now imagine what happens when they think you're working for Chicago." Miller studied the map with growing dread. His power had never been absolute. Prison hierarchies shifted like weather, but it had been stable, built on a foundation of fear that kept challenges to a minimum. Now that foundation was cracking. "They can think whatever they want. I know the truth. The truth doesn't matter in here," Frank Morrison said from the corner of the cell. "Perception matters, and right now it looks like you sold us out to the most famous gangster in America." Mickey Torres, usually the quietest of the group, finally spoke up. "Maybe you should talk to Capone, find out what he really wants. I tried that yesterday. Try harder." Miller had been avoiding that conversation because he suspected it would only make things worse. Capone would continue playing the innocent grandfather, offering help and concern with that maddening smile, and every witness to their conversation would assume they were discussing business. But his crew was right. He needed answers. The opportunity came during dinner the next evening. Miller walked across the mess hall with the measured steps of a man approaching a negotiation. Every conversation stopped as he moved through the room. 200 inmates watched him sit down across from Al Capone. Capone looked up from his meatloaf with genuine surprise. "Evening, son. Mind if I finish eating? We need to talk." "Of course. What's on your mind?" Miller leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I want to know what you're playing at." Capone chewed thoughtfully, considering the question with the same attention he might give a crossword puzzle. "I'm not playing at anything, just trying to help out a fellow convict." "I don't need your help. Maybe not. But you looked like you could use some commissary items." Capone's eyes crinkled with paternal concern. "Prison food isn't much. Little chocolate never hurt anyone." Miller felt his frustration building. This conversation was going exactly as he'd feared Capone, speaking in riddles and kindness while every witness assumed they were planning something criminal. People are starting to talk. People always talk in prison. Comes with having too much time and too little to do. They think I'm working for you. Capone set down his fork and gave Miller his full attention. "Are you?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Miller realized that any answer would sound wrong. Denying it too forcefully would seem like overcompensation. Admitting concern would seem like confession. "No." "Then you don't have anything to worry about." Capone returned to his meatloaf. Truth has a way of sorting itself out. Miller wanted to grab the old man by his shirt and force him to speak plainly. But touching Capone would only add physical intimidation to the list of evidence against him. So he sat there, trapped by his own reputation for violence. "Stop sending me things, if that's what you want." Capone nodded agreeably. Though I have to say, you seem to enjoy yesterday's chocolate. Miller hadn't touched any of the gifts, but denying it now would sound defensive. He was learning that every word in this conversation could be twisted into evidence of collaboration. He stood up and walked back to his table without another word. But the damage was done. Every inmate had witnessed a private conversation between the old king and the new. In prison logic, private conversations meant business partnerships. Tommy Andretti was waiting with barely contained fury. What did he say? Nothing useful. What do you mean, nothing? Miller tried to explain Capone's maddening responses, but the more he talked, the more guilty he sounded. Every reasonable explanation felt like an excuse. Every denial felt like a cover story. Frank Morrison had been watching the conversation from across the room. You two looked pretty comfortable together. We weren't comfortable. I was trying to get answers. Looked like you were getting along just fine. The accusation hit Miller like a physical blow. These were men who'd followed him into violence, who'd trusted him with their lives. Now they were looking at him with suspicion and doubt. That night, lying on his bunk, Miller tried to understand Capone's strategy. The gifts were obviously intentional. No one sent commissary items by accident. But what was the endgame? What did Capone gain by making Miller look compromised? The answer came to him slowly, like a disease spreading through his understanding. Capone didn't need to gain anything. He just needed Miller to lose everything. By destroying Miller's credibility with his own crew, Capone was eliminating his biggest threat without lifting a finger. Miller's organization would collapse from internal suspicion, leaving Capone free to rebuild the prison hierarchy around his own quiet authority. It was brilliant, it was bloodless, and it was already working. Over the next 3 days, Miller watched his empire crumble in slow motion. Card games that had paid him tribute started operating independently. Inmates who'd sought his protection began making their own arrangements. His crew still followed orders, but their obedience felt mechanical, temporary. Meanwhile, Capone continued his routine of quiet dignity. He read books, wrote letters, attended mass. He spoke to other inmates with the same grandfatherly kindness he'd shown Miller, but he didn't single anyone out for special treatment. No gifts, no private conversations, no obvious alliance building, which only made Miller look more suspicious by comparison. Why had the Chicago King chosen him for special attention? What made Butcher Bill worth Al Capone's investment? The questions multiplied faster than Miller could answer them. And with each unanswered question, his position grew more precarious. On the 4th day, Johnny Morelli approached him in the exercise yard with news that made Miller's blood freeze. Eddie's been talking to some guys, asking questions. What kind of questions? About you, about Chicago, about whether maybe it's time for new leadership. Miller looked across the yard to where Eddie Kolinsky stood with 3 inmates from the laundry detail. They were speaking in low voices, occasionally glancing in his direction. The body language was unmistakable, men planning something they didn't want observed. How many guys is he talking to? Started with just a few, but word spreads. You know how it is. Miller did know. Prison conspiracies grew like infections, spreading through whispered conversations and meaningful looks until they reached critical mass. Once enough inmates believed change was coming, change became inevitable. He'd used the same process to eliminate his predecessor 18 months earlier. Now it was being used against him. What do you think I should do? It was the wrong question to ask, and Miller knew it the moment the words left his mouth. Leaders didn't ask subordinates for advice about leadership challenges. They gave orders and expected obedience. Johnny's hesitation confirmed Miller's worst fears. Maybe you should talk to Eddie, clear the air. And if talking doesn't work? Johnny looked away. Then you better figure something out fast. Because this thing is moving, and I don't think you can stop it. That evening, Miller sat in his cell, staring at the commissary items he'd never opened. 4 days of gifts from Al Capone, sitting on his shelf like evidence in a trial. He could throw them away, but everyone had already seen them. He could give them away, but that would look like he was trying to hide something. There was no way to undo the damage. Capone had played him perfectly, using kindness as a weapon and generosity as ammunition. Miller was starting to understand that he wasn't just fighting for his position anymore. He was fighting for his life, and Al Capone had given him the rope to hang himself.